Homer Plessy, taking a stand against Jim Crow laws. On June 7, 1892, Homer Adolph Plessy, a member of the Committee of Citizens, volunteered to make a change and take a stand by sitting in the white section on a train to challenge the Louisiana Separate Car Act. He was arrested and charged with breaking the Separate Car Act. Judge John H. Ferguson denied Plessy's arguments that the law was unconstitutional. Plessy's case eventually made it to the Supreme Court, where they also affirmed Ferguson's decision and made the infamous separate but equal ruling. This trial brought national attention to the subject. Constitutionalized segregation continued for 68 years until the Brown v. Board of Education case. Even though Plessy's stand failed in the end, he had a very big impact on history.
Louisiana citizens stand together to fight the Separate Car Act. After the Civil War had ended in 1865, all the slaves were freed. 3 years later, the 14th Amendment was created. The 14th Amendment stated,
"All persons born or naturalized in the United States,"
which included former slaves recently freed. It also forbids states from denying anybody
life, liberty, or property without due process of law,
or to
deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws.
The lives of former slaves changed dramatically. However, many white Southerners still believed in white supremacy. White supremacists began to use violence and intimidation to oppress blacks. Southern states passed Jim Crow laws, which segregated the South. Some of them were very exclusive, like the law in Alabama that made it illegal for blacks and whites to play billiards together. Many of the blacks, whites, and other minorities were unhappy with the Jim Crow laws. Confusion about the legality of segregation continued on until Homer Plessy took a stand against it.
Jim Crow laws were constantly disputed because of their limits on freedom, which led to the Supreme Court ruling on the meaning of the 14th Amendment in 1883. The Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment did not give Congress authority to prevent discrimination. This meant that Congress could not stop segregation in any way.
In 1890, the state of Louisiana passed Act 111, also known as the Louisiana Separate Car Act. It required separate services for blacks and whites on railroads and separate railway cars. The law was immediately disagreed with by many Louisiana citizens. A white person is shut out as completely from the Negroes as the Negro is excluded from the white car. The Crittenden Press, Interpreting How the Separate Car Act Works, October 13, 1892.
The Comité des Citoyens, also known as the Committee of Citizens, was formed in 1891. This group of important black, Creole, and white New Orleans citizens were concerned about the new Jim Crow laws, especially the Separate Car Act. Their official name, translated to English, was Citizens Committee to Test the Constitutionality of the Separate Car Law. Homer Plessy was 30 years old and in the business of shoemaking. The Committee of Citizens asked him to get on a segregated white train car. There were multiple reasons why they asked Plessy and not someone else. One reason was he didn't have much family at the time, so if he was killed, less people would be affected by his death. They also chose him because he was of mixed race, and the Separate Car Act didn't define race. This meant that he would be white enough to get a train ticket, but black enough to be arrested for it. Plessy took a stand and accepted their offer because he wanted to change the Separate Car Act. Once Plessy had agreed, the committee raised money and hired Albion Torgey as their legal representation to fight the law.
Plessy takes his stand to Supreme Court. On June 7, 1892, Plessy bought a first-class ticket at the Press Street Depot and boarded a segregated whites-only train car of the East Louisiana Railroad in New Orleans. The railroad company knew about Plessy but was in favor of him taking a stand because the Separate Car Act required them to buy more cars to accommodate the law. Plessy was arrested by a private detective hired by the Committee of Citizens to make sure he was accused of breaking the Separate Car Act and not some other law.
At Plessy's first trial in Plessy v. the State of Louisiana at District Court, Judge John H. Ferguson dismissed his contention that the act was unconstitutional and sentenced Plessy to a $25 fine. He immediately sought a writ of prohibition, which was an order by the Supreme Court to cease the case and hand it over to a higher court. The Supreme Court accepted Plessy's request for a writ of prohibition, so the case then moved on to Louisiana Supreme Court. Torgey again argued that the Separate Car Act, which required East Louisiana Railroad to segregate their train cars, was unconstitutional. The arguments of Plessy's lawyer were denied, so Plessy again requested a writ of prohibition, which the Supreme Court accepted. This prejudice, if it exists, is not created by law and cannot be changed by law. Massachusetts Supreme Court, Louisiana citing a past case that spoke about the prejudice segregation produces, 1849.
Many white supremacists were mad at the fact that Plessy was challenging segregation and that Supreme Court had accepted Plessy's writ of prohibition. Southerners who were against Plessy argued that segregation wasn't unconstitutional and didn't break the 14th Amendment. The court case then went on to Supreme Court, where they made two cases. Oral arguments were heard on April 13, 1896. The court case rendered its decision 1 month later on May 18th. Both of these cases also failed because the Supreme Court upheld the ruling that separate but equal was okay. In my opinion, the judgment this day rendered will, in time, prove to be quite as pernicious as the decision made by this tribunal in the Dred Scott case. Justice John Marshall Harlan predicting how much of a negative effect this ruling will have in the future, 1896.
Plessy versus Ferguson is a very important case in that it's the first case that holds that discrimination, as in Strouder under the Constitution, is not the same thing as separate but equal laws.
68 years of separate but equal.
In the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, the judges ruled 7-1 that dividing the blacks and whites was okay as long as the division was equal and fair. Writing for the majority, Associate Justice Henry Billings Brown rejected Plessy's arguments that the Separate Car Act violated the 13th and 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution.
Brown wrote, "We consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with the badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it." Justice John Marshall Harlan spoke for the non-majority when he wrote, "I am of opinion that the state of Louisiana is inconsistent with the personal liberty of citizens, white and black, in that state, and hostile to both the spirit and letter of the Constitution of the United States."
This ruling got a lot of publicity and was at the center of controversy. This put segregation in the spotlight and brought many people to protest the Jim Crow laws. After the ruling, Plessy went back to his regular life. He fathered children and continued to stay active in his social and religious life. Plessy worked for People's Life Insurance Company and died in 1925 at the age of 62.
The Plessy v. Ferguson case legitimized segregation and the Jim Crow laws. The ruling of Plessy v. Ferguson helped segregationists and strengthened segregation's hold in the South. This separate but equal era lasted from 1896 until 1964, at a total of 68 years. Schools, theaters, restaurants, and transportation cars were segregated. Poll taxes, literacy requirements, and grandfather clauses not only prevented blacks from voting, but also made them ineligible to serve on jury pools or run for office. Although Plessy's stand was a failure, the Supreme Court would end segregation in 1954 with the Brown v. Board of Education ruling.
Homer Plessy stood up for what he believed in to try and change the world for good. Even though his attempts at stopping segregation didn't work, he brought a lot of much-needed publicity to the topic. His stand also affected us negatively because it legitimized segregation when the Supreme Court ruled separate but equal. It took over 65 years for Plessy's dreams of striking down segregation to finally become true.
This little song that I'm singing about, people you know is true. If you black and gotta work for a living now, this is what they would say to you. They says, if you was white, you'd be alright. If you was brown, stick around. But as you black, oh brother, get back.